Good morning, good afternoon, and in some cases, it is good evening. We have people joining us from all over the world, and we're so happy that you can join us today for a very exciting webinar. My name is Carlos Velasquez, and I'm with HMA Associates, and I want to welcome you and give you the bienvenida for today's webinar, Transgender Health, which is a part of the Getting to Zero 5-part series. And this is the 4th webinar in our series. And we are so excited to have an amazing speaker with us today. So I am going to do some quick housekeeping. I'm going to start actually asking you to hide your video and keep yourselves on mute as a way of being able to be a bit conservative when it comes to the bandwidth, because the last thing we want is to lose you. You either zoom out, you freeze, and it's just too nice a day to be freezing. So if you could please mute yourself and kill the video, I would appreciate it. If for any reason you have any kind of technical issues during the course of today's webinar, we ask that you reach out to Adam Ungson with HMA, and he'll be more than happy to provide any kind of technical support. I do have to do a quick reading of the video consent statement. By attending this remote webinar event, you agree to the privacy policy of Santa Clara Public Health, as well as the unassociated remote hosting service. Some of your personal information, such as name, image, may be shared. And so if you don't want that to be shared, you can go ahead and rename yourself, and you can call yourself anything you wish. Your remote attendance hereby discharges Santa Clara County Public Health from all claims, demands, rights, promises, and liabilities. And so we ask that if you consent to that, go ahead and remain with your image there, or if you don't want to, you can change the image or you can change your name, and we'll be fine with that. If you could advance my slide, Dr. Sebelius. So all presenters of this continuing medical education activity have indicated that neither they nor their legally recognized domestic partner has any financial relationships with commercial interests related to the content of this activity. It is now my pleasure to welcome all of you to mental and behavioral health in the transgender community. And if you could show the next slide, Dr. Sebelius, I will introduce you formally. Dr. Sebelius, the pronoun they, them, is associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and is a licensed clinical psychologist at UCSF Center of Excellence for Transgender Health. Dr. Sebelius' community-led research is focused on developing and evaluating transgender-specific trauma-informed interventions to promote health among transgender and gender-diverse people in California and Sao Paulo, Brazil. Dr. Sebelius' work is recognized, and we're so happy to have Dr. Sebelius with us. Clinical interests lie in the intersections of sexuality, sex, and health, and identity. And with that, Dr. Sebelius, I turn the stage to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I really appreciate the invitation to speak here today. So excited to see so many people joining us to learn about transgender health on what's an eventful week. And good morning and good luck to all of us. I am really excited to talk to you about mental and behavioral health among transgender people. As Carlos mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, so I'm very interested in this topic, although primarily my research is really focused on HIV prevention and treatment among transgender and gender diverse people, and I really focus a lot on community engaged research in particular. But as part of this presentation, what we're going to learn today is to define the terms intersectional stigma, and I'll be talking about the framework of intersectionality, which is a very emergent framework in the context of public health research right now, and very exciting, and gender affirmation as they relate to transgender health. I'm going to describe how stigma and unmet need for gender affirmation leads to health disparities among transgender people. And at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to describe at least 3 sources of resilience for transgender people. So to start, we're just going to sort of informally ask you to reflect on how familiar you are with terminology, concepts, and data related to transgender communities and their health. And you can go ahead and put this in the chat or reflect on this beyond the responses that were given. But really, this is just a sense to give us a sense of how familiar people are with transgender communities. The language that we use to talk about transgender identities is always evolving. It's different across geographic contexts. And so I'm just really interested to see, if there's interest in doing a little bit of introduction to some of the concepts, or if folks would rather just dive right in. So I'm seeing a lot of numbers. It looks like most people are saying they're pretty familiar, although we have some folks who are a little bit newer to concepts around transgender identity and health. So it looks like we're really have an audience that has some familiarity and experience with this topic. Okay, I'm seeing that my deck shifts to my background when I check the chat, so I'm going to try to limit that as much as possible. So let's start out by talking about stigma. And this is something that we talk about quite a bit in public health, especially in HIV. People are very familiar with thinking about HIV stigma and stigma more broadly. But when we talk about stigma in the context of transgender health, I want us to think about some specific types of stigma. And research studies on this topic have really proliferated in the last 5 to 10 years, documenting that stigma contributes to negative mental health outcomes. Multiple studies report that disproportionately high rates of depression, anxiety, and overall psychological distress among transgender people compared to cisgender people are attributable to stigma. And stigma is not just one thing. A lot of times we think about stigma in terms of what we call enacted stigma, which is sort of overt discrimination, overt harassment, and even violence fall under the realm of enacted stigma. That's stigma that is actually turned into action by someone who is stigmatizing another person. Whereas anticipated stigma is the sense of expectation that you will experience enacted stigma. So anticipated stigma is what we think about when people avoid healthcare because they're afraid of being discriminated against or being treated poorly. And that sense of anticipated stigma can lead to hypervigilance on the part of the person who is anticipating that stigma. And that hypervigilance, sort of anticipating stigma in different interactions, that in and of itself can lead to poor negative mental health outcomes. It's a source of stress, it's a source of anxiety, and has been documented to lead to poor mental health outcomes. Internalized stigma is stigma that has been turned inward, just like the term implies. And it's stigma that is turned against oneself and one's community, internalizing negative beliefs about one's identity or belonging to certain social groups. And what we find is that this type of stigma, internalized stigma, is potentially the most damaging to someone's well-being. It can negatively affect coping, and it can also reduce an individual's resilience. And so we see through research that these types of stigma lead to poorer mental health, which can then lead to poorer behavioral health, which means people will start avoiding healthcare and perhaps using substances to cope with the impacts of the depression, anxiety, and the stigma that they're facing. So some of the questions when we look at these relationships, some of the questions that come up are, what are some protective factors? How can we interrupt these relationships between stigma, poorer mental health outcomes, and poorer behavioral health outcomes? How can we intervene on these relationships? And that's probably the core question at the heart of my own research on intervention development. So thinking about stigma and in a more nuanced way, recently public health has brought into focus this concept of intersectional stigma. And this comes from the theory of intersectionality, or the framework of intersectionality, that was originally put forth by Black feminists. Kimberly Crenshaw in particular is credited with really popularizing intersectionality as a lens through which we can think about things like health disparities and other types of marginalizations that oppressed communities experience. And the idea is that, you know, we all belong to multiple social categories that intersect with one another to create our unique experiences. So in this talk, we're thinking particularly about transgender people, but transgender people also have race and age, potentially an occupation. And so for people whose social position, those intersecting social positions, when they are located at the intersection of multiple stigmatizing forces like racism, transphobia, ableism, ageism, or stigma around behaviors like engaging in sex work or substance use, that intersectional stigma creates a social context of increased vulnerability and risk of negative health outcomes, such as poor mental health or poorer behavioral health. And so you can see there are different ways that someone might cope with intersectional stigma at these different levels. Avoidant coping might be isolating oneself or engaging in substance use as an escape, avoiding healthcare altogether, whereas protective coping mechanisms include resilience, getting support from other people, and access to transition-related services. And I'll talk a little bit more about those protective factors later in the talk. So this is the model of gender affirmation, and this was a model that I started to develop when I first started thinking about developing interventions for transgender people to reduce the risk of HIV acquisition and to improve HIV treatment outcomes. And at the time, there really were not any trans-specific theories of how stigma, such as transphobia, leads to negative health outcomes. And I was really interested in what is unique about transgender people's social context, transgender people's experiences, where we can really leverage some of those strengths, some of those protective factors, and start reducing the risk related to these negative health outcomes. And so the idea behind this intervention really came from the social psychological idea of identity threat. And what happens when someone's identity is negated or disaffirmed by other people, they experience what's called identity threat. And psychologically, people will try to restore their sense of identity in whatever way is available to them. But in the context of social oppression, where we don't have a lot of access to gender affirming services, whether that's gender affirming healthcare where someone's identity is respected, or transition related healthcare where someone has access to the transition related services that they need. When there is decreased access to gender affirmation, that creates this unmet need or identity threat, whereby the person then tries to meet that need for gender affirmation in ways that might increase risk. For example, seeking hormones from non-medical providers, street hormones, as they're sometimes called, or black market hormones, and that can be dangerous. Silicone use is another example of trying to meet one's needs for gender affirmation in a way that might increase risk. Substance use to cope with unmet need for gender affirmation is another example. So I won't go too far into this, but that's sort of the framework through which I often think about transgender health and reducing risk. And to talk a little bit more about these concepts, need for gender affirmation and access to gender affirmation, this came out of some qualitative research that I did with transgender women of color when I was thinking about, what is gender affirmation and how does it, how is it lived? What is the lived experience of both needing gender affirmation and having access to it or not having access to it, as the case may be? And what I found was that these dimensions really varied independently. Some folks reported really high need for gender affirmation, lots of desire for transition-related procedures such as hormones and surgeries, whereas other people did not have as high of a need for those types of gender-affirming services as others. The desire to be affirmed as male or female also really varied. The desire to quote-unquote pass a cisgender or live stealth, which is some of the language that people used in the interviews that I did, really varied within the sample of women that I spoke to. Access to gender affirmation was also really variable. Access to gender affirming healthcare varied widely. Access to affirming relationships such as supportive family, peers, lovers and sex partners, and then inherent ability to pass a cisgender. So some women that I spoke to really struggled with, for example, being very tall or being very, visibly trans, whereas other women that I talked to were very comfortable being identified as trans. So the main point here is that these dimensions vary a lot between people. Transgender people are not a monolithic group and have really different needs and really different levels of access to the care and support that they need. And what we have found, and this is borne out in research time and again, is that the people who have really high access to gender affirmation, but maybe lower need for things like transition-related medical care, we don't see as much risk in those populations. But the folks who have low access to gender affirmation and a very high need for it have what we call a high unmet need. And those are folks who are really trying to meet that need for gender affirmation in riskier ways. And so I wanted to give an example of intersectional stigma and how this really plays out in extremely emotional and critical ways for people who are living the experience of facing multiple types of stigmatizing forces. And the Transgender Day of Remembrance is a very poignant example of how intersectional stigma plays out as real world consequences, literally life or death consequences in terms of who is safe and who is not safe. And violence against transgender people, as I'm sure you all are well aware, is an epidemic, particularly among transgender women of color all over the world. The Americas in particular have extremely high rates of murder of transgender people and transgender women specifically. And due to the intersection of multiple stigmatizing forces, in this case, we're talking about transphobia, sexism, racism. In the US, African-American transgender women again and again are found to suffer the worst health outcomes in almost every realm that we currently study. And there are some interesting exceptions to that I'll mention a little bit later. So violence as a form of enacted stigma is extremely prevalent among transgender people. And the 2015 US Transgender Survey is to date the largest survey in the US of transgender people. And so you'll see a lot of data and reports coming out of this particular survey because of its large sample size. They surveyed almost 30,000 people from all 50 states of the US and found very high rates of violence. Reported 53% reported lifetime physical assault and 13% just in the past year. Sexual assault was equally almost as high as physical assault. Verbal harassment, 54% just in the past year, people reported being verbally harassed. Employment mistreatment was very broadly defined. It could have included a denial of job or promotion or being fired because of one's gender identity, also included verbal harassment or physical assault at work. 30% experienced this just within the past year of the survey. And family violence and rejection was also very high. Just in the past year, people reported being physically assaulted by a family member, and 8% had been kicked out of the family home. And enacted stigma within healthcare clearly leads then to anticipated stigma and subsequently avoidance of healthcare. So this is something that we can really think about as healthcare providers and people who are shaping the experiences of transgender people in the healthcare environment. 33% had had at least one negative healthcare experience related to being transgender, and 23% avoided healthcare they needed in the prior year out of fear of mistreatment due to being transgender. And so attention being given to things like using correct pronouns, using the correct name when addressing someone, it's not just polite, it's essential to addressing healthcare disparities among transgender people. If we want people to continue to come get the healthcare that they need and to address these types of disparities, it's absolutely essential. So going back to the issue of family support and how critical that is across the lifespan, it's not just among youth, but has long-term consequences for health outcomes among transgender people. The USTS split their sample by respondents whose families were supportive and respondents whose families were unsupportive. And these are adults responding to these questions. So it's not just within the context of young people where adults are more likely to experience homelessness when their families are unsupportive, more likely to have attempted suicide, and more likely to report currently experiencing serious psychological distress. So families, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, are a critical kind of entry point at which we can start to really intervene upon some of the both structural disparities and psychological and other health disparities experienced by transgender people. And this is a comparison of different studies, large studies of both transgender youth and adults and cisgender youth and adults, to start to get a sense of, how trans people compare to cis peers of their same age group. And you can see with suicidal ideation, extremely high rates among both trans youth and trans adults as compared to cis youth and adults. Depression is higher, self-harm, as well as suicide attempts. And in the Minnesota Student Survey, which is about 80,000 students who are surveyed, and they have about 2,000 who are reported transgender or gender nonconforming, the trans and gender nonconforming students reported 3 to 4 times the rate of psychological distress as their cisgender peers. So these disparities are very real and very pronounced. One interesting finding that the USTS found when they looked at how this compared across age groups within transgender people is that they found that the percentage of people who reported currently experiencing serious psychological distress went down as the age of the respondent increased. And we see this to a certain extent with cisgender people, but it's particularly pronounced with trans folks. And there are different reasons why this may be. But one of the things that I think that this really speaks to is how important the role of mental health providers are for among our young people. And Joe Olson, who is a pediatrician in Southern California, wrote this really beautiful piece in JAMA Pediatrics, speaking to the need for us to rethink the role of providers more broadly in transgender health, but particularly among youth. And the way that we really need to move away from thinking, especially of mental health providers as gatekeepers, especially as gatekeepers for gender affirming care among young people, and think about the lack of resources that we really have currently for transgender youth in this country, and think more about mental health providers as a source of support and less putting them in the role of gatekeeping. So this is a study of self-reported physical and mental health outcomes among gender non-conforming adults, as opposed to transgender people who do identify along a binary. And this is something that has been coming out more and more, where we're looking at gender diverse people who don't identify within a gender binary and finding that self-reported health outcomes are actually more negative among folks who identify as non-binary than trans people who identify along the binary. And so in this particular study, they found that gender non-conforming adults were more likely to experience poor or fair health as compared to binary identified folks, had difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions, or had any kind of limitation on their physical or mental health as compared to binary identified trans people. Similarly, a study of college students, very large sample who identified outside the gender binary, 892, they found that compared to binary identified cis and trans people, non-binary participants reported higher levels of all negative health outcomes that they measured, including harassment, sexual abuse, traumatic events, anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. Non-binary individuals also reported more frequent self-harm and suicidality, with nearly 50% of non-binary students in this sample reporting suicide attempts. And this finding that non-binary folks experience more distress than binary folks, whether those binary people are cis or trans, might be attributable to certain structural aspects of non-binary experiences, such as just other people's lack of knowledge about what non-binary identities are, what non-binary experiences might be, how to use pronouns to address non-binary people. Non-binary folks might also have poorer access to legal and medical resources because of some of the barriers that we've created around things like you need a diagnosis of gender dysphoria for certain types of access, and just systemic discrimination against non-binary people. When we have such a strong binary lens with which we see the world, it's very easy to erase non-binary people without realizing it. So substance use as a coping strategy for some of the types of stigma that we've been discussing is also very prevalent among trans people. And there's been a lot of studies of how substance use is linked to enacted stigma and experiences of discrimination and trauma. And so these are just two studies that I highlighted here, where in New York City, a 3-year prospective study of 230 transgender women, they found that enacted stigma, or what they were calling in this study gender abuse, was found to be associated significantly with substance use and heavily mediated by depressive symptoms. So people who reported higher levels of enacted stigma, and depression in particular was associated with substance use. And in San Francisco, where I'm based, 292 young transgender women reported, 69% of them reported recent drug use, and this was twice as likely among those who reported any type of gender-related discrimination or PTSD. And those reporting psychological distress had higher odds of using multiple heavy drugs. So we do see that trans adults and trans youth use drugs at a higher rate and in more dangerous ways than cis youth and adults. And so we really need to think about substance use, not as a problem that's located within the individual, it's really a symptom of mental health, as well as structural well-being, access to structural supports, and also reflects an individual's level of access to certain protective factors such as family acceptance, housing, safety, economic opportunity. And we often think about substance use as an addiction that lives within a person, but really what we see time and again is that it's a reflection of someone's structural position in society. We also see this in the USTS sample where they looked specifically at respondents who said they were currently working in the underground economy, which could be sex work, it could be working with drugs. But those who are working in the underground economy in the USTS were nearly twice as likely to engage in binge drinking and in heavy drinking as those in the overall sample. So if we think about working in the underground economy as a type of economic marginalization, substance use again is reflecting that structural inequality. So let's think a little bit about resilience and protective factors. We've talked about how stigma leads to psychological distress and potentially reduced self-care through things like avoidance of healthcare that people need, different types of risk behavior, and that this obviously can lead to poor health outcomes. And these social forces, social oppression and stigma, are really driving these relationships. But how can we think about intervening upon these relationships, and what are some of the protective factors that we see bear out through the literature? One, of course, is social support. And that can look like formal support from mental health providers or an important person, such as a family member. It can look like connectedness to one's transgender community, but it's extremely important to interrupting these relationships. Internal resources are things that we might be able to help shore up within a person, such as pride in one's transgender or gender diverse identity, and really giving people positive coping resources or building those up that a person already may have. Structural resources, of course, we have been referring to those throughout, things like employment, economic opportunities, access to education are extremely important, and gender affirmation. So these are transition-related factors, even giving someone the hope of transitioning or the hope of gaining access to the medical procedures they desire. We actually see some positive health outcomes from that. Actually having access to these factors and someone undergoing the transition that they desire for themselves, coming out as trans or gender diverse, and then other gender identity related factors, just a general acceptance and comfort with oneself. So one's own psychological affirmation as well as access to medical affirmation. And we do see this bear out in the literature that increasing these protective factors does lead to better health outcomes. So I'll talk about each of these and some of the literature that supports these individually. In a 2013 study on stigma, mental health, and resilience among an online sample of transgender people, they found that indeed enacted stigma was positively associated with psychological distress, but this relationship was significantly moderated by peer support. But it was only at high levels of peer support. So this so in order to have an effect, this peer support needs to be very strong and very consistent. Peer support at low and medium levels did not moderate the relationship. So the effect of enacted stigma on mental health can be very durable, but ongoing, regular, consistent support from peers can be powerful enough to reduce this relationship. Family support is a key resilience factor in the face of stigma. This cannot be stressed enough. It predicts greater self-esteem, better overall health. It's been shown to protect against depression in adulthood, protect against substance use, and suicidal ideation and attempts. And this has been borne out again and again in the literature on both youth as well as adults. And I think is a really key and unmet nexus of intervention where really giving families support and thereby giving that trans person support within the context of their family can be a really key intervention strategy. And trans community itself is a key source of social support. Social support, whether it's connectedness through online participation in social support groups, or access to accurate information about transgender health. We find that connectedness to transgender community has been associated with lower depression and anxiety, especially among transgender women. It's found less so among transgender men, and that hasn't really been investigated as deeply why that relationship is not as strong there. But in general, social support was associated with fewer mental health symptoms among all participants in the USTS. And then, of course, gender affirmation, both medical gender affirmation or access to gender affirming treatment. They found that in youth, transgender children who have socially transitioned, so have been presenting as the gender that they identify with, and or have received some type of gender affirming treatment in adolescence, such as puberty blockers or hormones, grow up to become adults that have the same level of mental health functioning, mental health status as their cisgender peers. Other types of gender affirmation include legal affirmation, so access to the ability to change one's gender markers on their documents or to change one's name. And then, of course, psychological affirmation or an internal sense of pride in one's identity, and the social affirmation that we've been talking about. What we find is that, over time, once a person transitions, whatever that looks like for them, whether it's a social transition or living in a non-binary identity, that serious psychological distress wanes over time the longer that they've been sort of living in their own truth. And that initially there may be a spike in anxiety as they experience some levels of rejection and some enacted stigma, but over time that this does wane with successful transitioning. Again, whatever that looks like, as trans people, again, are not monolithic. But here is a quote. This is from USTS that I feel sort of encapsulates what many transgender people have said to me over the years as I've been working in these communities. This person says, "I have struggled with depression and anxiety ever since puberty. I've failed classes, isolated myself, and considered suicide because of this. A year ago, I felt hopeless and had daily suicidal thoughts. And today I've got a plan for the future and haven't had a serious suicidal thought in months. I firmly believe this is because of transition. I feel so much more comfortable and happier than I've ever been." So, in conclusion, what we've been discussing this morning is that due to stigma, trans and gender diverse youth and adults do experience poorer mental health and behavioral health outcomes than their cisgender peers. And this is influenced heavily by intersectional stigma. But there are points of intervention, there are protective and resilience factors that we can look to start interrupting this relationship. That's social support from peers, families, and trans community, access to gender-affirming healthcare, structural resources such as housing, employment, and education, and internal resources such as identity, pride, and coping. What we really are looking to in the research community is in terms of future directions, things that we need to learn more about in order to continue to address these health disparities, so that we really need more research on non-binary identified individuals. We're finding that more and more, especially young people, are coming out as non-binary and identifying with different types of non-binary terms, and we need to understand those experiences better. We need to increase access to gender-affirming mental health care, and I'd also say gender-affirming medical care, provide education and support for families with transgender and non-binary youth, especially those experiencing different types of intersectional stigma, such as families of color, and facilitate transgender health research outside of US and Europe, where currently most of our information is coming from. And I just wanted to also put a plug in for some of the intervention research that I've been conducting with my community partners and collaborators in terms of trying to intervene and boost some of these resilience factors that we see already existing in transgender communities, but providing different types of structural support. We've been working in jails, we've been working in clinics, and we've been working in community settings, all within transgender communities who are really dreaming up these projects, leading these projects themselves, and we're just sort of giving them the resources and the tools to evaluate those programs and implement them in their communities. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really thrilled to answer any questions that you may have.
Dr. Sebelius, thank you so much for those amazing, insightful comments. I'm getting lots of questions, so I hope you're ready.
Sure.
So during the course of our discussion, if you have any additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And Dr. Sebelius, would you be so kind as to give me control back of the deck so I can prepare for our other panelists? So the first question I have is an interesting one. What does a healthy transgender person look like?
First, I'm going to ask you how I give you control back.
Oh, I'll ask for it.
Sorry.
Sorry
Okay, thank
that.
you. Thank you. What does a healthy transgender person look like? I mean, I would say that a healthy transgender person looks like a healthy person. We really have to think, holistically about all people, and I think that looks like someone who has the support that they need, who has access to safe and affirming healthcare, who if they do have health conditions, has the access to the treatments that they need, and is able to function in a way that they really feel like they can live their life to the fullest in a safe way and connected to other people. I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't be talking about transgender people and cisgender people. We'd be talking about people with all kinds of identities, and be able to respect and accommodate those in ways that don't disadvantage certain people over others.
Very well, thank you. The next question is about the level of domestic violence in transgender relationships. Are there any studies that look at that?
Absolutely, yes. In particular, we've seen most of the studies looking at intimate partner violence as experienced by transgender women in particular. And the rates are definitely extremely high. There's a lot of studies that look at some of the drivers of this, of interpersonal violence, and clearly transphobia and the power dynamics that can result in a violent relationship are definitely exacerbated And yeah, there is definitely research out there, and there are new measures that are coming out too that look specifically at how intimate partner violence might be experienced uniquely by transgender women. So sometimes that looks like someone withholding hormones from a person, someone calling a person by their dead name, calling them the wrong pronouns, you know, assaulting their identity essentially, and those kinds of unique forms of interpersonal violence experienced by transgender women in particular, I think are getting more and more attention lately.
As a follow-up, do you feel that there are enough resources in relation to either shelters that actually can work with the trans community? Are there courts that are sympathetic, or do you still think that there are a lot of barriers?
Yeah, great question. You know, so the majority, of course, of shelters for women experiencing violence are set up for cisgender women. I think there are variable levels of ability among those shelters to accommodate transgender women, but I think across the board it's very low. You know, trauma plays out in all kinds of ways. And what can often happen is, even if a shelter is willing at the level of staff and management to accommodate transgender people, transgender women may experience violence from other people staying in the shelter. And not feel safe or welcome there. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, especially among services that are designed specifically for cisgender women, whether it's safe housing, healthcare services that are designed for cisgender women, other types of you know, gender-based services that you know, we have a lot of work to do, not just within the staff and management, but also the people seeking those services and making sure that people feel safe accessing them.
Very good. The next question is interesting. Is there a hierarchy within the transgender community in making reference to those who pass or don't pass?
Yeah, that's a good question. That does come up a lot. You know, I think it really depends on who you ask. Like, like I said earlier, you know, because transgender communities, they're not monolithic, they're extremely diverse. And I think within some subgroups of transgender people, there is that hierarchy. There are some people who really, really value the ability to pass, looking a certain way, just like cisgender people do. You know, that our society really imposes these kinds of standards of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what is a beautiful man, what does a beautiful woman look like, and even cisgender people have a lot of variability in terms of whether they subscribe to those standards or not, or value them. And I think transgender people are just as diverse in terms of what they value, in terms of what's desirable or beautiful. But our society certainly tells us in many, many ways what they think we should value. So,
very good. The next question. They use the words cisgender and non-binary various times during the presentation. Can you please define these words?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for asking that. So in very simple terms, cisgender is someone whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. So someone who was assigned male at birth who now identifies as a man, someone who was assigned female at birth who identifies as a woman or as female. Non-binary is someone who identifies outside of the binary of male or female, who do not feel that the terms male or female, man, woman, really describe who they are. And transgender people can be binary identified, so transgender man, transgender woman, or just man or woman of transgender experience. Cisgender people similarly can identify within the binary, and a non-binary person can identify with all kinds of different terms. We hear terms like gender queer is a popular term. Gender non-conforming is often used to talk about non-binary folks. But non-binary itself has become more popularized lately, but can also kind of serve as an umbrella term for people who just don't identify within that binary of male female.
Very good. The next question reminds me of an experience I had actually. So I used to chair the Human Rights Commission in Arlington County, Virginia. And one of our cases was related to in a childcare setting that was kicked out because the child wanted to wear a dress, and it was a young boy. And the parents in this case were both attorneys, so they set up the case to go on to other legal issues and to challenge the teacher, who definitely didn't think that a boy wearing a dress was allowed in the childcare setting. And so fortunately, the commission sided in the favor of the parents, and the case is ongoing. Interestingly enough, the question I have here is ask the question, how can you foster healthy gender identity in children as a parent?
I would say the best possible thing you could do is listen. Really listen to your child and really foster that sense of self-determination within the child. That sense that child will be loved for who they are, that they are free to express themselves in the way that feels most authentic to who they are, and that they will be safe and they will be protected by their family. That's the best way I know how. It's not always easy to do. I know, and that there can be really difficult situations that arise within the context of extended family and extended community, especially in different cultures based on different cultural norms. So it sounds simple, but I know it's not easy. But even just having one supportive adult in a child's life who's trans has been shown to have tremendous protective effects. So just knowing that there's one person who loves you for who you are, and one person that you know you're safe to talk to and express yourself with, that you can go to when you have a negative experience, is tremendously, tremendously important.
Excellent. Well, that question has actually created an interest, a lot more questions. So I'm going to start addressing these questions for you, Dr. Sebelius. The next question related to what you just said, are there organizations that support transgender parents, siblings, and family trainings of sort?
Yes, it looks like someone just put one, Omega put one in the chat here that I hadn't heard of. So thank you for that. That's a great share. The one that I'm most familiar with, there are many out there, and lots of resources online. The one I'm most familiar with, because I'm here in the Bay Area, is Gender Spectrum. They have online groups for families. They have groups for teens, groups for parents of young children. Back when we could do things online, they had these amazing camps for trans kids. And in my younger days, when I had more energy, I volunteered at these camps, and these kids just were amazing. And the ability for them, the opportunity for them to come together with other youth and see other trans kids who are also thriving, kids who are older than them that could serve as role models, meeting other families that are also supportive. And then the parents would go off and have their own support groups while the kids were off doing fun activities like swimming in the pool and playing games, and just really, really transformative experiences. And I know there are other groups who do similar types of retreats and camps for kids and families. And I think these experiences have the potential to be incredibly transformative for the entire family. So yeah, I think there are tons of resources out there, and really encourage anyone working with families to check them out.
A similar question, but one specific to teachers. Are there any trainings for teachers, educators?
That is a good question. I'm less familiar with resources for teachers. If anyone knows of anything, please put it in the chat. I know there are some trainings that are school-based, but the schools can be difficult because you do have to get buy-in at a lot of levels. And I haven't worked at that kind of, structural level, getting buy-in from principals and school districts and things like that. But I'm sure there is some work being done at that level, but I'm less familiar with it.
Yeah, I know a few years back I saw some things come out of GLSEN. I don't know if they're actively still working in the area, but I think that we can do some research and share that while we're on here with the webinar. So the other questions I have here, in relation to the huge number of trans folks that said they had suicidal thoughts, is that specific to young people or adults?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the comment was about the high percentage of trans folks that had suicidal thoughts. Was that study looking at adults or young people?
I actually presented studies that looked at both. And so we do see suicidal thoughts, the higher rates of suicidal thoughts among trans people, both youth and adults. But we do see that depending on how you ask the question, if you ask transgender adults, have you ever had suicidal thoughts? Then you see trans adults reporting higher levels, partially because they've had longer lives and more opportunities, unfortunately, to have those thoughts. But if you ask someone, have you had suicidal thoughts in the past year, for example, you'll get higher response rates among trans youth. So that psychological distress does tend to be higher among young people. And you see that among cisgender people too, that suicidal ideation, unfortunately, is high among our adolescent and young adult population across the board. We need to do a better job kind of really serving our young people.
Years ago, I used to work for a youth center that specifically was for LGBT youth. 90% of the youth that were there, that came to the center, were homeless. And I remember one of the life lessons I had in my life was being given a tour of all the dumpsters behind restaurants where a lot of these kids were actually eating from because they knew which restaurants were throwing away food that was a little more palatable. And that says a lot about what the reality of trans youth really entails. And so it's important to have a safety net and for all nonprofits to be as inclusive as possible. But it's a tall order though, I know that. Omega has some more questions. Are there any trans masculine studies?
Absolutely, yes. I do think that the emphasis has been on transgender women, and that is partially driven by the fact that transgender women have such high disproportionate rates of HIV, and the majority of transgender health research has been funded by HIV dollars. And so we've really been digging deep in terms of how to address the extreme disparities in terms of HIV acquisition and poorer HIV treatment outcomes among transgender women. So we've seen the majority of the research focused on transgender women, but there have been quite a few studies on transmasculine people, some also focused on HIV, but some focused on other aspects of transmasculine life experiences. Some of that has had to do with experiences, getting different types of healthcare. I worked with one medical student who was really interested in transmasculine experiences of pregnancy. And we did a study of trans men who had been pregnant and looking at, different experiences around pregnancy. They really ran the gamut in terms of diverse experiences of pregnancy. But family planning has been, in particular, something that some folks who are interested in transmasculine experiences have looked at. I recently completed a study of a PrEP demonstration project that included all transgender people, and we had quite a high percentage of trans men interested in PrEP and pre-exposure prophylaxis for preventing HIV. And many trans men identify as gay and bisexual and are having sex with cisgender men, which then, does bring up the question of potential HIV risk and also risk of potential pregnancy. Many transgender men think that if they're not menstruating, they can't get pregnant, which is not always true. So we do see some unintended pregnancies among gay and bisexual transgender men. There's also been a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot because we definitely need more, but there have been a few mental health focused studies of transgender men and young transmasculine people.
Very good. Thank you so much. The next question that Omega asked, are there any trans-identified individuals working with your organization, Dr. Simonides?
Thank you for that question. I love answering that question. We are the majority of transgender identified individuals working within UCSF are at the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health. We are trans and non-binary identified individuals, leading research within our own communities. And we have trans and non-binary folks at all levels of our organization. So not just frontline workers, but principal investigator, project directors, data managers at all levels of the organization. And we also work very closely with our communities. So we, the people who work with us are not just within UCSF, but also within the communities we work with.
Very good. The next question is interesting, and it reminds me of the fact that in the Stonewall riots back a few years back, Sylvia Rivera, a transgender Latina woman, is the person supposedly who threw the first bottle at the cops. So the question I think relates well here in relation to, are there any studies that are specific to African American and Latina transgender women?
Yes, there have been quite a few studies specific to African American and Latina transgender women. In particular, I would look to Tonya Poteet's work. She's done a lot of work focused specifically on Black and Latina transgender women. The majority of our studies at the Center of Excellence for Transgender Health are focused on transgender women of color in particular, majority Black and Latina women. Because partially because the HIV rates are so disproportionately impacting these communities. So a lot of our programs are specifically designed with and for transgender women of color, with the emphasis really being on Black and Latina transgender women. And the PrEP demonstration project that I mentioned earlier was one of the sites was La Clínica de la Raza in Oakland that primarily serves Latino communities in Oakland. And they recently, as part of our PrEP demonstration project, started a gender affirming trans health clinic where they provide both access to hormones and PrEP. And now they've expanded also to ART for treatment of HIV. And so we have a very large sample of Latina transgender women from that study that we did a lot of qualitative work with, in addition to looking at their PrEP kind of uptake and adherence, because we were really interested in sort of the co-location of PrEP and hormones at that clinic. That was the main thing we looked at, but we also looked at a lot at the importance of having a culturally specific program for Latina transgender women. And some of the women who were accessing that program had never accessed formal healthcare ever in their lives because of their fear of their documentation status being discovered. But La Clinica was a really safe place for them to be able to be in their own community at the same time accessing gender affirming care.
Excellent, thank you. The next question I have is in relation to fair housing for transgender community. And the Fair Housing Act was changed in, I think, 2012 to protect against discrimination. A lot of people don't know that. And so I'm wondering if you have any research about the level of discrimination there is for housing in the trans community.
It is high, unfortunately. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the USTS looked, broadly at, all 50 states, and people experienced very high levels of housing discrimination, and I think it's a really critical structural issue for trans communities. They're even with policies like that in place, it's not always possible to prove that someone's been discriminated against due to their gender identity, and so many people feel like they don't have any recourse when they experience this type of discrimination, and they just can't get access to housing. So it also reflects sort of the broader economic marginalization that transgender people experience. Starting from being forced out of school when they're young due to bullying that they experience as young people, and then not having the same educational opportunities, which translates into employment opportunities, and economic marginalization, which limits access to housing where they experience discrimination. So all of these structural issues are very intertwined. And I think even though there is some documentation of the issue, I think we need more research to understand how we can intervene in ways that actually increase access to things like housing for people, and protect them against discrimination in real ways.
The next question I have is in terms of treatment for drug and alcohol use or abuse. Are there special programs for the trans community that are available?
I mean, certainly not in our area. We have had in the past some, there was one specific, sort of trans-specific substance use recovery program. I think that is another sort of structural issue in terms of creating services and resources that are truly safe for transgender people. We talked a lot to people about their experiences in substance use treatment that were trying to be inclusive of trans folks. And again, when you've designed a program for, say, cisgender women, and you want to welcome transgender women in, it's not always possible to make sure that the other people participating in that program are being welcoming and safe for that trans person as well. And also a lot of the issues that people face in their lives and are dealing with as consequences of substance use, things like cisgender women are often dealing with losing custody of their children, for example, which very few transgender women have experienced or can relate to, and they might have some very specific experiences around their transition that they're wanting to work through. And so I think it is really important that some of these services are trans-specific and are really designed to meet the needs of transgender communities. But I personally don't know of a lot of resources available like that right now. If anybody knows of anything, please do put it in the chat.
One particular interesting conversation I've had with our local jail is to make sure that the transgender community is understood and that the facilities there are appropriate. But I'm guessing that's probably quite unique. And I'm wondering if you know of any studies or in your work you've encountered working with the the prison or jail systems.
Yes. In fact, we've been working with the San Francisco County Jail for 5 years. We've been designing a program called Girlfriends Connect that is specifically designed to help transgender women transition from the jail setting back into the community, making sure that they get the resources and the services that they need when they transition back, because we know that that is a very sort of fragile time in terms of people kind of losing, kind of falling through the cracks and not getting the support they need to transition back into the community. So that's something that we've been working on. And in the San Francisco County Jail, they did have sort of a separate area where the transgender women lived, separate. It was within the men's jail, but it was a separate, what they call pod. there are, pros and cons to creating those kinds of pods within correctional settings, but there has been some experimentation with that within prisons as well. Yeah, there's a lot more there, but we have done some of that work.
Mhm. Unfortunately, it took a lawsuit in our case to get the police
Oh,
department
wow.
to, yeah, and they lost. They lost big on that one.
Wow, good.
Sometimes those things are necessary. You got to fight within the system.
Absolutely.
So the next question I have is in terms of, you keep making comments about the HIV transmission and infection rate. What is the infection rate amongst trans community?
Among transgender women, we in the US, because we don't report on transgender women at a federal level consistently, it's hard to say what the rate is among US transgender people as a whole, but it's estimated to be somewhere around 28%. Among transgender women and higher among Latina and African American transgender women. Some studies have shown almost as high as 56% among African American transgender women in some cities. So quite high among transgender women. Among transgender men, studies have shown somewhere around 3%. So still higher than sort of the base rate of cisgender people in the US, but much higher among transgender women than transgender men. And to my knowledge, there have not been any studies that look specifically at non-binary folks.
Fascinating. You mentioned during your presentation, Dr. Sebelius, the term underground economy. And so I'm guessing that's in reference to sex work, selling drugs. What would the impact of decriminalizing sex work be for the transgender community?
I think I'm very much pro decriminalization of sex work. I think that decriminalization would reduce the stigma, would increase our ability to provide much needed services to sex workers. We have a clinic here in San Francisco called St. James Infirmary that specializes in providing healthcare services to sex workers. And I think having more services like that available that really understand the unique needs of sex workers, both trans and cisgender, and non-binary for that matter, would, I think anything that can increase support, increase access to much needed healthcare, and decrease stigma is absolutely beneficial in terms of what we're trying to do, which is reduce health disparities. So yes, I think decriminalization of sex work would have a hugely positive impact on transgender folks who are engaged in sex work in particular.
It was interesting. I made a comment about the transgender youth that gave me a tour of the garbage dumpsters in the restaurants in Minnesota. Another life lesson for me was being given a tour of the bridges in LA County, in that what they call a river. There are bridges there. And so there are a lot of transgender people living underneath those bridges that are homeless, that are former sex workers. And they have become older and less desirable. And so this advocate that I had met and was working with actually created these programs to be able to transition older sex workers into different kinds of work skills. And so the question I have is studies on older trans folks. I mean, do you have those studies, and what resources are needed?
Yeah, great question. I think recently there has been a lot more interest because there is such a high need for resources and information about how to serve older transgender people. And I think there are a lot of needs there, a lot of things that get exacerbated. Like you mentioned, sort of ongoing economic marginalization can get worse with age. People have more health care needs as they age, different healthcare needs as they age, and isolation can become a real issue, social isolation in older age. And I think while some things actually get better with age, like I mentioned in my presentation, there's reason to believe that mental health actually improves with age among transgender people. But there are other things that can be exacerbated, and I think there's a lot more that we need to know. One of the things that comes up a lot when I talk to transgender women is no one can actually find the source of this of this data point, but people quote this data saying that the average lifespan of a transgender woman is 35.
Mm.
And I don't know where that came from, but it's something that has circulated. And what many transgender women that I've worked with have said to me is that, you know, I didn't expect to live this long. I'm 50 years old. I'm 60 years old. I'm, 69 years old. I didn't expect to live this long. So there are certain like longer term health outcomes like, diabetes, cardiovascular health, brain health, different things that, get worse with age or come up as people age that they didn't necessarily plan for or have like a long-term kind of vision for their own health and their own life. And so some of the things they didn't think they were going to have to deal with, they do when as they get older and are actually needing more support and more healthcare. So I think we need more research on our trans elders, with our trans elders, and by our trans elders, so that we can better understand their needs as well.
You mentioned the term stealth. Can you define that a little more?
Stealth, yes. So that is a term that is not my term. That's a term used within communities to be undetectable as trans. So stealth is someone who is perceived as cisgender when they go about their day-to-day life. So it's sort of a way of talking about living under the radar as a trans person.
So does that imply that they're not out as a trans person? Is that what that means, or?
They, in some cases, yes. I think if someone's living what's quote unquote completely stealth, then maybe they're really passing in every aspect of their lives as cisgender. But stealth can also be referred to as being perceived as cisgender in certain situations, like public situations or in an employment situation, for example, and they may be out in other aspects of their life, like with their family or their spouse or things like that. So yes.
Very good. Then okay, this is actually a question from me, but I'll put the response in the chat room. So thank you, Teresa. The next question, this is a fascinating question. I mean, they're all fascinating, but this is really making me think. Are studies about the lovers or the sex partners of transgender, are there any?
There are some. The majority of the studies that have come out about sex partners of and lovers of transgender people have been primarily focused on cisgender male partners of transgender women. And again, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the research, the transgender health research, has been fueled by HIV prevention dollars. So a lot of this has been done with an HIV prevention lens. Excuse me. But some of the research on cisgender male partners has looked at the identity of the cisgender male partners and really seeing that, do they identify as straight? Do they identify as a man who has sex with men, or bi, or and that it's really all over the board. Cisgender men who partner with transgender women are all as diverse as any other group. So we see all kinds of different identities and sexual orientations and behaviors among partners. We're currently conducting a study of transgender women and their partners of any gender. That is a couples intervention for HIV prevention. So we're really working with couples to help them create HIV prevention plans within the couples. So often the couples are serodiscordant, or they are both HIV negative and have partners outside of the relationship. So really helping couples learn to kind of communicate and develop plans around keeping themselves and their partners safe.
I have a naive question from me. This is my own question. In relation to the Affordable Care Act, are gender reassignment surgeries allowed to be covered as a cost?
That is state by state. And so in some states, yes, and in some states, no. And I'm currently working with a junior faculty member who is looking at the impact of those policies on the health outcomes among transgender people. So depending on what their state level policy is, or looking at like pre-policy implementation, post-policy implementation, and how that is impacting transgender communities in the state.
Okay. The next question I have is coming from New Mexico, actually. What does it mean to be an ally to the transgender community?
That's a great question. You know, I don't know how many other people have heard about or have been thinking about this difference between ally and accomplice, but it's something that has been talked a lot about in the context of Black Lives Matter. And, you know, that an ally is someone who is, you know, supportive and maybe, you know, outwardly kind of educating themselves about the issues experienced by a community that they're allying with themselves with, and sort of walking, you know, in parallel with the person. Whereas an accomplice is someone who's really taking on for themselves that fight for equal rights, and really as an accomplice in the revolution, if so to speak, by really enacting change on behalf of and in collaboration with the communities that they are seeking to align with. And so I think, you know, really the place to start always is with oneself in thinking about allyship, you know, self-education, being willing to venture out, make mistakes, be corrected, learn more, teach more, and, you know, being willing also to take risks within your organization to advocate for change, to make transgender people and non-binary folks safer and feel more welcome within your organization. So I think, you know, there's a lot there about proactivity. Like, what can you do to create jobs within your organization? What can you do to support the trans people who are already working there? Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Next question. What can faith-based organizations do to be more inclusive and affirming of transgender populations or communities?
Ooh, that's a big one.
We've had a big week.
Yes, yeah, big question and a big week. I mean, gosh, that is it's such a good question, and it's so nuanced, and you know, it's so dependent on which faith you're talking about, because, you know, we have so much variability in terms of how people think about what it means to have a faith, what it means to be a faith-based organization. What faith are you talking about, and what kind of policies are in place that that are trans inclusive versus legitimizing discrimination against transgender people? Because, you know, transgender folks have had a lot of trauma around faith, being part of faith-based communities growing up who have rejected them, who have outright, you know, traumatized our young people. And there are faith-based communities who are incredibly welcoming and inclusive and have shown people a sense of safety, a sense of belonging. And so, you know, I think ultimately, really thinking about, like, what does it mean to be a faith-based institution, and what is being communicated to transgender communities about what it means to be part of that faith, what kind of environment is being created. Yeah, I think it's a very complex question, and has a very complicated history and present, because we all know, that our current, or hopefully most recent past president, has tried to enact, executive orders that have legitimized discrimination against trans folks and other sexual and gender minority folks based on faith. And that can be very, very triggering for people who have had faith-based trauma experiences in their lives. So I think there is a lot of work to do, and that there can be positive experiences that come out of faith-based communities, but it's very complicated. People have very complicated relationships to those communities.
Very good. I have another question. Have there been any studies on this treatment and sentencing of transgender people in the criminal justice system?
Have there been any, can you say that again?
Have there been any studies on the treatment and sentencing of transgender people in the criminal justice system?
I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure about the sentencing piece. The treatment, I'm not sure what is meant by treatment, but there have been studies on people's access to gender affirming medical treatment while they are incarcerated. And most recently, there was one of the first surgeries that happened while someone was in prison, a gender affirming surgery. What has happened in the past is that when prisons are mandated to provide gender affirming surgery to currently incarcerated people, they release that person rather than actually provide them the treatment that they're mandated to provide. So we've seen that happen again and again. There is a paper that I wrote with Valerie Jeunesse that covers challenges and opportunities for gender affirming medical treatment in prison settings, or in correctional settings more broadly. And that is really a review of the literature that has, and the studies that have been conducted on access to medical care for currently incarcerated transgender people. So I would point you to that article for more comprehensive review.
So that question has, or your response actually has stirred other questions. So the question is, beyond HIV, are there other health disparities that transgender people have to live through or work with?
Well, other than sort of the mental health and behavioral health disparities that I covered in my topic, there is, some research looking at cancer and cancer disparities. Some of these types of disparities, like cancer, for example, and some cardiovascular health studies may be related to some of the behavioral health issues that I also talked about, like smoking. So rates of smoking among transgender people are higher than cisgender folks. And as we know, smoking can cause lots of health problems down the road. And so we do see those disparities play out as transgender people get older in terms of cardiovascular health, cancer outcomes. And some of the health disparities too have more to do with more negative outcomes because of avoidance of healthcare. So sometimes transgender people will avoid healthcare until their health conditions become so urgent that had they sought care earlier in the course of their condition, their outcomes might have been better. So a lot of the disparities that we see really can be traced back to some of these behavioral health issues that ultimately are driven by stigma.
Very good. The next question, are there studies that look at undocumented transgender people?
The studies that I'm most familiar with are the ones that have been conducted at Bienestar, which you mentioned in the chat, Carlos.
Mhm.
There have been some studies, and I can't remember if they were specifically working with Latina transgender women who were undocumented, or if they were comparing folks who were documented versus those who did not have documentation. So, but I know Bienestar has published quite a bit on this topic, and has done some great work in the Latina transgender community in LA.
They have, it's interesting. I had an experience one time. I was doing some work with the Pan American Health Organization, and I had to do some research around the kind of stigma that existed in Central American communities, and not only the disparities, but the lack of the infrastructure to do any kind of HIV treatment. And I was asked to be an expert witness at a court case for immigration court to say that the transgender person, if forced to be deported, would face great discrimination. And so the judge sided in favor of the transgender person, realizing that, in fact, a political asylum can be executed based on their gender identity. But it was a very interesting, unique case in New York. I hopefully things are better now. I don't know. I know that there are special visas that can be granted for people who are subject to domestic violence. I don't know to what extent that can be granted to trans individuals who are facing persecution in their own countries, but I think there's a lot to still consider there. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, Dr. Sebelius.
And certainly we have seen a huge rise in asylum cases among transgender people. And there are some legal organizations that work specifically with transgender people seeking asylum because their home countries are not safe for them as transgender people. And we worked with several Latina transgender women who were able to get this kind of asylum at La Clínica de la Raza, and La Clínica has some programs helping people who are seeking asylum there as well. We've also talked with people from Middle Eastern countries who have been able to secure asylum here in the US because their home countries are not safe. So I think the precedent for that kind of asylum seeking among transgender people it has definitely been strengthened, and that it's possible. It's a possible pathway for sure for people. There are a lot of resources out there for folks to pursue.
Another question I have in relation to hate crime legislation. Is the transgender community always included in such legislation, or are they left out?
Yeah, it's certainly not always. Definitely variable, extremely variable. And it's another thing that's hard to prove or enforce. When a hate crime is committed or a murder is committed, many of the murders of transgender women in the US, no one is ever arrested or prosecuted. And even if we know that it was motivated, it was transphobic, or it was a hate crime, there's no way to hold a person accountable. Yeah, and many of those murders go unsolved, unfortunately.
So what you're saying, I mean, do you know of any cases at all that have been prosecuted all the way through?
Oh yes, oh absolutely, there have been.
Okay.
Yes, and some that have been prosecuted as hate crimes, but it's not always possible to prosecute something as a hate crime, and certainly transgender people are often not included in hate crime legislation.
Yeah,
I believe Transgender Law Center, I think it's Transgender Law Center that keeps a map, like an interactive map where you can see state by state the types of legislations that are protective for transgender people across the country.
Okay. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues if they can do a quick search for that and post it in the chat room. So can you repeat the name of the organization, Dr. Sebelius?
Transgender Law Center.
Okay. Very good. The next question is interesting. Has marriage equality made a difference for the transgender community?
I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I tend to think that combating stigma that is, marriage equality is also gender-based, a gender-based kind of policy. But I don't think marriage equality is at the top of the list of priorities of, many transgender people. I think that it's, some of the danger of thinking about LGBT communities is that the T often gets left out, invisibilized. Their priorities are not at the top of the agenda of organizations that purport to advocate for LGBT communities. Certainly some transgender people do identify as, gay, bisexual, in same-sex relationships who benefit from marriage equality. And like I said, destigmatizing any kind of gender-based exclusionary policies, I think benefits everyone, but I don't think it's like one of the top priorities of many, transgender folks who are really seeking like structural resources and access to care.
Access to care, housing, jobs.
Mm-hmm. And Omega just posted in the chat, sex and gender are different. Yes. Sexual orientation is separate from gender identity, and all transgender people have a sexual orientation, just like all gay and bisexual people have a gender identity. And those things, they vary independently of each other. And sometimes when we use a term like LGBT, we forget that these things are different identity constructs.
Okay. Another request for clarification. You use the term gender queer. Can you explain that?
Sure. So gender queer is a term that often is used somewhat interchangeably with non-binary. Gender queer has been around a while. I really saw the peak of it being used sort of in the like 90s, 2000s. It was very popularized. I think people still do use it to a certain extent. But in a kind of similar way that we talk about queer as a sexual orientation, it's sort of like queering this idea that there are only two genders, or the idea of same sex is a binary concept. Gender queer is also sort of like queering that gender binary. So someone who identifies as non-binary may or may not also use the term gender queer. But it has similar implications as non-binary, maybe a little bit more of a political tie to the idea of the queer movement.
Very good. Omega, as you see, put the word pansexual. Can you define that?
Sure. So pansexual has more to do with sexual orientation. And so when we talk about, say, lesbian, gay, bisexual, that often invokes a binary, whereas pansexual is a way of talking about pan meaning all, so all genders, all sort of a very inclusive sexual orientation that also is sort of a challenge to binary concepts of gender and sexual orientation. I love it.
Omega keeps sharing. You saw that one.
I think Omega should unmute and
I think so too. Omega, do you mind
vocabulary.
Yeah. Do you want to share your screen with us? We're loving what you're sharing. Or not share your screen, but do you want to
unmute?
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Hi. I don't know if you guys can see me or not.
See.
No, but we love the image you're using.
Oh. I heard you a little bit say you wanted me to come on. I didn't hear exactly what I know I've been texting and putting in some stuff, and you are
Yeah.
great with your responses. I am thankful to be involved and had got the invite for this, and to actually finally be on a presentation that is as accuracy can be.
Whoa.
So thank you for that as well.
Well, I was curious if you wanted to say something about heteroflexible.
Yes, so it's in addition to like you're explaining with hold on. Trying to get my thing to, can you guys see me now? I'm not sure if it's showing up. Okay. All right, because I can't see, I just see the PowerPoint. Okay, well, heteroflexible is just basically like used as a term for individuals like who are like queer or bi, whether you're gender non-conforming or cisgender or trans, and it's in the terms for people to understand when they don't understand that trans people can also be identified as straight and or gay and or lesbian. So it's the heteroflexibilities of the presentation, as we say, for instance, a cisgender couple, married couple, in their presentation, look how they look, but when they're inside of their home, it's the opposite of what's expected of hetero couples. So the woman is the pegger and the man is the receiver type of thing. And then going into those terms and words kind of go on a whole nother level where people don't understand things at too as well. So that's like heteroflexibility, being open to switch roles and accepting of sexual behaviors and desires versus the orientation, the sex, and then the gender.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
No problem.
Well, thank you, Omega, for sharing that, because that's similar to things that I have heard of in the Latinx community, where the lovers of the transgender individuals identify very differently in terms of their desires and wants, and not necessarily always using what we traditionally consider LGBT at all. They don't want to be identified. They don't want to be used labels. And maybe flexible is that they just want to love. And so this fluidity, and I saw that a lot, especially about young people, it's just, don't label me. And I wonder, Doc, are you seeing the same thing, Dr. Sebelius?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I think young people, as young people do, kind of, are blowing up these concepts, these more rigid concepts of gender and sexuality, and really rejecting that, sort of rigid labels or binaries or categories. And it's interesting because I'm on the advisory board of the Pride study, which is out of Stanford, where they're doing very, very large, a very large study of health among sexual and gender minority folks. And the number of write-in responses for gender identity, you can say, write in what how you like to be addressed or how you identify in terms of your gender. And the number of creative responses, just everything you can think of. I mean, unicorn was one of the top unique responses, but just all kinds of things. There's like demi girl, demi boy. I can't possibly conjure all of the different names, but there are a lot of identity terms that people are really creating for themselves and asserting the fact that, like, I am self-defined. I am who I am, and I'm going to tell you who I am, and I'm not going to check your box. And it's really cool because I think that we're evolving in that way, and I think really when it comes down to it, self-determination and freedom to be authentic to who you are is really what it boils down to, deserving respect and dignity.
Excellent. Now, a friend of mine commented that within the Black Lives Matter organizing efforts, at least on this side of the coast, there have been efforts to try to understand, to try to be inclusive of trans lives and how they matter. I'm wondering if you've seen the same thing on the West Coast, or is that something that I'm seeing more on the East Coast?
Oh, yeah, we definitely have seen it here on the West Coast too. And I think, of course, there needs to be more, um, more inclusiveness, more acknowledgement. And, I think that it's, there can be some difficulties because of, some trans people have experienced transphobia from within their own communities, from within Black communities. And that we all have transphobia within our communities to confront. And I think the Black Trans Lives Matter movement has had a lot to say about that, and I think really deserves a really big platform, because it's getting to the root of the fact that we all have challenges within our communities around transphobia and around marginalizing certain groups, um, that where people, there are real life consequences to this type of marginalization and violence.
Mm-hmm. Another question I have here is that they've noticed that people are identifying their pronoun use. What's the impact of that?
One benefit of all people identifying pronouns, whether you're cis or not, is that it normalizes people presenting their pronouns. So it doesn't put transgender people on the spot of having to always clarify their pronouns, whereas cisgender people don't have that same kind of burden. So if everybody does it, then it sort of normalizes it for everyone, and it normalizes people asking if they're not sure what pronoun a person uses, or to not assume. And the other piece of this too that I want to acknowledge is that one of my colleagues mentioned to me that they don't want people to use pronouns for them. They just want their name to be used. So sometimes when they are in a situation where people are being asked, what pronoun do you use, they feel awkward because they don't want to use a pronoun. So we do have to think about a way to acknowledge that some people don't want to be referred to using pronouns, which I thought was an interesting perspective, because it's something that I personally hadn't thought as much about. But I do think it's beneficial. Just a couple weeks ago, there was the first International Pronoun, International Pronoun Day. I don't know if anybody knows what the title was of it was exactly, but it's something like International Pronoun Use Day or International Pronoun Day. And UCSF had a whole background that you could put on your Zoom with your pronouns, and it was just cool because it acknowledges that pronouns are a source of potential discomfort and disaffirmation for transgender people who have to correct people. So it helps when cisgender people help to normalize that disclosure.
Great. So we can just name names here. It's an interesting question. So the person's saying that they know of workplaces that are very inclusive, very safe, like Starbucks and Home Depot. And they're wondering if this is, again, an issue of state by state protecting against workplace discrimination.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm not as clear. I mean, because I would imagine that there are corporate policies that places like Starbucks and Home Depot can enact. I also have noticed that at least here in San Francisco, again, I'm in a bubble, so I can't speak for all of across the country, but the Whole Foods here in San Francisco and in the Bay Area in general, I've noticed have lots of trans and not gender non-binary, non-conforming folks working there. And it probably does have something to do with corporate policies, and it could also have to do with insurance policies, because different organizations can enact different types of policies around their healthcare insurance, whether or not people have access to gender affirming care through their employment insurance. So like UCSF has a really great policies around access to gender affirming healthcare through our insurance system, and people have really had to fight for that level of inclusivity. So it's great to hear that people have noticed that at Starbucks and Home Depot as well. I didn't know about Home Depot in particular.
My Home Depot, I noticed, and we have a very special Starbucks here in DC. Not only are there transgender people working there, but it's also the first Starbucks where the entire staff is deaf. So,
cool.
And the technology is fabulous. You should see it. It's really interesting because I don't sign, but I can use the technology there to communicate with everyone there. It's really amazing, and they're very inclusive. So we did get some comment here about International Pronoun Day is celebrated on the third Wednesday of October. It seeks to make respecting, sharing, and educating about personal pronouns commonplace and encourage inclusive language for those who may identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender neutral, and more. And I'm going to say probably heteroflexible, as Omega has educated us now. And I actually like that a lot, Omega. So hopefully you'll will share your contact information with me privately, because we need to keep talking. I learned a lot from some of your comments, and it's wonderful with that. I have another question. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So I have another question. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the work that has been done is specific around HIV prevention in the transgender community. Are there other studies that have nothing to do with HIV, is looking at other issues?
Oh, certainly, yes. As actually my presentation today was not focused on HIV, it was mental health and behavioral health. And so, I think there has been a lot of research on health disparities more generally. So I think, it's one of the things that we talk about in transgender health research is that there tends to be, rightfully so, there tends to be a lot of focus on the urgency of addressing health disparities because people are actively suffering, but we also need to remember that all these kind of negative health outcomes are not all of who transgender people are. And we really do need to also be documenting things like resilience and, the community, the beautiful communities that transgender people create, chosen families. There's some research on, house ball communities where transgender people are very welcome and included. And so sometimes I think, health research can get really skewed into this, into a negative framework because we are really driven by wanting to improve health outcomes where we see that there are disparities and that people don't have equal access to healthcare. But there is more, people are thinking more and more about resilience, about the impact of things like policy research, for example, that someone asked about earlier, the importance of studying the impact of positive policies on transgender health longer term. So when you enact a policy that increases access to gender affirming healthcare, does it in the longer term result in fewer health disparities or improved health outcomes? So that type of research, I think, is happening and needed, and also research around resilience in particular. Yeah.
Excellent. I actually sit on the Commission on Aging, and so the thing I'm constantly reminding people is that we are incredibly diverse, and we need to think about our older adults within the LGBTQ community, because as the tendency for our entire population to get grayer, we're along with that whole graying population, and our needs need to be listened to. And then I
Absolutely.
have one last question, actually a request, Dr. Sebelius, because we're almost out of time. If you could share with us some closing comments and what your wish is for the next year for all of us.
Well, my wish right now is for us to close this election with positive news. I know that it's not going to solve all of the world's problems or even all of the US's problems if this election turns out the way I hope it does. I hope I'm allowed to say that. But I do think that giving us some hope around coming together in our communities and really starting to heal the divisions that have been exacerbated and illuminated over the last 4 years is really what I'm hoping for, is that we have the opportunity to do some healing as communities. And as difficult and traumatizing as 2020 has been for all of us, I have been really heartened by how I've seen communities also rise up together to express and perform acts of solidarity, to find ways to connect even when we can't come together in person, to support each other. And so that gives me hope. And I hope that, the next year brings us more of that, and that we're all in a place where we are open and learning and really reaching across differences to come together for the benefit of all.
Thank you, Dr. Sebelius. It's been wonderful to hear your insightful words and learn about your research. I want to take a moment to thank everyone who's been with us today. And I can tell you there have been some people who have become now little groupies of these webinar series because they've been with us all 4 webinars. We love that. But I also want to thank the Santa Clara County Health Department, the Health Trust, and the Pacific AIDS Education and Training Center, and everyone who worked behind the scenes to make this webinar possible. It's been great. And with that, I'm going to sign off and have a wonderful, wonderful day, evening, afternoon, or wherever you're joining us. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.